Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening. My name is Armin, and this is my presentation for the American Literature Lab. It's about Adabi Wells, who we are going to see who she was. So first of all, I would like to give a brief introduction of her. So Adabi Wells was one of the most important people in the struggles of the African American people. She was born in Mississippi from parents who in 1862 were still slaves. This is before the Emancipation Proclamation, this is before the end of the Civil War. So her parents are still slaves, and by the time she's very young, she's 3, the Civil War ends, and the country reunites, and slavery is effectively abolished. So she goes to school in a local school in Mississippi, which was established by the Freedmen's Bureau. So Freedmen's Bureau was in those years in charge of training, educating, and preparing the African Americans who were formerly enslaved in order to, bring them back into the regular American life, to lay the ground for their reintegration into the society. She started her work as a local journalist and then moved on to become one of the most prominent journalists at the national level and also international. We're going to see that she was an influential person because she traveled around the country and talked about the anti-Black violence, which was very important and which was very highlighted and visible, notable in the South after the Civil War years. And she somehow shed light on the fact that the slavery is over, but this does not mean that the African American people are living a normal life. They're being subjected to sheer violence. She was one of the fundamental members of the Naacp. She was that is National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and she worked vehemently in order to advance the construction and the formation of this organization, which in the next years came to play a very key role and is still active today. She was also one of the most important members of the movement that sought suffrage voting rights for women. And she is less often named in the group of women who participated in the voting rights movement. So, well, all these things put together, this is actually why I decided to speak about Adabi Wells. So, before we move on to the next of this, I would like to introduce a familiar story which many of us have heard about, but it was not exactly, but the version we know is not about Adabi Wells, it's about someone else. So, Adabi Wells was on a train going from Tennessee to Mississippi, and she was removed from a car because that car was considered not to be for Black people. This is 1884. This is not still the Jim Crow years. And, in her memoir, she mentions that, in those years, the Jim Crow rules had not come into effect yet. Even so, there were some, local versions of local implications that some parts of the country, some atmospheres, some places were not, some spaces were not available to Black people. This is a kind of, crucial thing because it reminds us of how gradual and how slowly the Jim Crow era laws came into effect and came into existence. So she takes the matter to the court, and she eventually gets a $500 damage from the train company. And the state Supreme Court accepts her charge against the train company. And well, many people somehow believe that this story is somehow overshadowed by Rosa Parks' story, and the fact that because Rosa Parks' story was more recent for us, and because it also had more of controversial and scandalous consequences, and it had bigger aftershocks. Because of that, we probably are not very much familiar with what happened to Ida B. Wells. So, Ida B. Wells was working as a journalist, but at some point, 3 of the people that she knew very closely were lynched in Memphis. And in her memoir, she mentions, this citation that I put here, while I was just carrying on the work of my newspaper happily in the thought that our influence was helpful and that I could make a living out of it, there came the lynching in Memphis, which changed the whole course of my life. And it exactly does change the whole course of her life. From this point on, Ida B. Wells exclusively starts focusing on the issue of lynching in the South, which continued for long years, unfortunately. And she engaged with, actively working over this issue. So now that place where those three people were lynched, in her memoir, Adabi Wells mentions that it was called The Curve. And so she was the editor of a local paper, which was called Free Speech. And she started working on that issue, the circumstances that those people were lynched. And she started writing on them. And when her writing somehow was read by some people in the surrounding areas, the news of that lynching reaches north, and she's invited to New York. So when she moves to when she travels to New York in order to talk about that lynching, the headquarters of her newspaper was attacked, and because of that, she is advised to permanently, stay in New York. Do not go back to South. And this sort of, she holds this an exile, and she says that, oh, now that I was not in the South anymore, it made me even bolder. It made me even more vehement in my fight against this issue. And in 1892, she goes to the Lyric Hall in New York, and she reads a testimony of this event with very gruesome details. And she talks about how bloody and how horrible this event was. And the commotion that this testimonial brings up was something that somehow started her anti-lynching campaign in the US. Now, this story booms and takes her to Europe. She visits Miss Catherine MP, and Miss Catherine MP was an English lady who was visiting New York. She was the editor of a newspaper called Anti-Caste, and she was working for the civil rights of the colonial subjects to the British Empire in India. And when Mrs. Catherine Impey meets Ida B. Wells, she asks her to go to England with her. And here, Frederick Douglass joins in and encourages Ida B. Wells to go. Frederick Douglass refuses to go with her because he was old, but encourages Ida to go all the way to England and talk about the heinous crimes which were being committed in America against African American people. She goes extensively across Britain in many different cities a number of times, and she gets published in a number of papers in England. And people in England are abhorred by the understanding of what happens to African Americans in the United States. And this was something that nobody could at first believe, but when the details come, when the names come, when the locations come, it becomes a matter which was completely unarguable. So when Ida B. Wells comes back to America, she forms something which is called a women's club. And she engages in forming some local women's club. Women's club were popping out everywhere in the country, and this is where she meets Susan B. Anthony. Now, Susan B. Anthony was one of the most prominent activists of the suffrage movement, and she tried very much to gain the suffrage for women. And so Ida B. Wells meets Susan B. Anthony, and Susan B. Anthony actually supports her in her struggle very much. And Ida B. Wells then starts going around the country, empowering and talking in women's club again about the lynching issues that was going on in the South. This was again something that in many parts of the United States, not many people knew about it. Or, if they did, they somehow decided to deny it. She also helped Susan B. Anthony reach the South, because Susan B. Anthony's activism was very much limited to the Northeast area and to to the Atlantic coast, where, which was more of an elite zone. But thanks to Adabi Wells' knowledge about the South, Susan B. Anthony managed to somehow work her way around the South and organize events and conferences in different important cities to promote the cause of voting rights for women. And Adabi Wells and Susan B. Anthony had a very respectful relationship, but she states in her memoir that we had disagreements with each other over a number of issues. The first one being about the matter of social justice. So Adabi Wells was very much focusing on the issue of social justice, where Susan B. Anthony somehow believed that when women get their rights to vote, social justice will be achieved automatically. It's not necessary to focus on two things, social justice and women's voting rights. When women's voting rights is obtained, the other will come by automatically. This was something that Adabi Wells strongly disagreed with. We can understand from her resume of activities. Another thing was about the Black women's suffrage. While Adabi Wells insisted very much that women's suffrage has to be colorblind and has to be universal, not based on race, Susan B. Anthony was very reluctant about giving Black women the right to vote. And she somehow even refused to engage people like Susan B. Anthony somehow refused to engage people like Frederick Douglass in her South tours because she did not want to create conflict among the white people in the South by having a person like Frederick Douglass next to her. And another issue, which is very interesting, is the issue of motherhood. Susan B. Anthony did not believe in women of a certain caliber, like herself, like Adabi Wells, getting married, having children, because she believed that these kind of activities remove their focus from their struggle and limits them to their motherhood. While Adabi Wells had a very strong vision about motherhood. So Adabi Wells gets married to F.L. Barnett in 1895 in Chicago, and so F.L. Barnett is a lawyer in Illinois, and they get married there. And in about a year, they had their first child. And because of the responsibility of child nursing and childbearing and child rearing, Adabi Wells decides to actually quit journalism and resign from all her activities and responsibilities. And but this does not take a permanent shape. While this goes on, Adabi Wells comes back and tries to create provisions for mothers in workplaces. She starts from her own women's club, and she starts saying that if this women's club is supposed to have something like a daycare, something that we know as a daycare now, that if members of this community, if members of this club have children, that place is supposed to take care of them so that the women would not need to drop down their responsibilities, their social responsibilities, in order to take care of their children. Now, next is Adabi Wells' role in the formation of NAACP. And she goes around the country, tours, and talks to different people about the importance of such an association. She then participates in the committee that was supposed to be considering how this committee should form, how this association should form, what goals it should pursue. But then and then, like, when the first list of the people was drafted, Adabi Wells was one of the two signatories of the state of Illinois. She was like this appeal, this kind of list of demands was something that the Black people were actually trying to construct in order to celebrate Lincoln's 100th birthday, and the fact that although Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, in his 100th birthday, Black people were still having a hard time. So she goes around the country, she participates in these activities, but then eventually her name was removed from the list of the 40 founders of the National Negro Committee, later named as NAACP, by the famous historian W.E.B. Du Bois. Adabi Wells, because of this, holds or held a personal grudge towards W.E.B. Du Bois. She continued her activities in AACP, but she was very upset for the fact that her name was removed to include the name of 3 white people who had never actually, her name, her husband's name, and her associate's name were removed and replaced by 3 white people's name who had not even participated in the inaugural meetings of the NAACP. In these days, Adabi Wells also established Alpha Suffrage Club. Now, Alpha Suffrage Club was a club that was active in Illinois, and they sought somehow to work for the suffrage of the Black people in Illinois. Women in Illinois gained suffrage in 1910. So women started voting at local elections in 1910 in the state of Illinois. But they were using their vote, white women in Illinois were using their vote in order to abolish Black people's voting rights altogether. This is a very curious decision. Alpha Suffrage Club somehow was created in order to fight back against this abhorrent measure taken by the white people who were voting. Now, through activism, Alpha Suffrage Club organized events and seminars and conferences, raising awareness of the Black people over their rights, over their civil rights, and about the importance of their participation in politics. And Alpha Suffrage Club also threw their weight behind the election of the mayor of Chicago, of the aldermen of Chicago, and when the candidates that they were supporting won the election, Alpha Suffrage Club somehow managed to protect the Black people's voting rights in Illinois. And they later moved to Washington, D.C., and they pushed for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that is the women's voting rights that is enshrined among the amendments of the U.S. Constitution. So that said, I'm almost through with this. Adabi Wells today, or Adabi Wells after her life, because of the fact that she suddenly died in 1931, and then came the Second World War, and then came the Civil Rights Movement. So for a number of years, Adabi Wells was in absolute oblivion. Nobody remembered her, nobody knew about her. She wrote her autobiography that you see here in the picture, and she was not, she didn't get the chance to finish her autobiography. So her incomplete autobiography was published much later in the 1970s, and she went through this long period of oblivion, and probably also because, you know, the civil rights movement introduced another generation of heroes and activists who somehow, as I said previously in the case of Rosa Parks, overshadowed Adabi Wells. Now, her autobiography was published by her daughter in the 1970s, and today there is an Adabi Wells Foundation for Investigative Journalism. But every year they support young journalists who have bright prospects in order to conduct researches into the civil rights and social justice issues. This this institution is located in University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So, well, on this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and that's my presentation. Thank you.